Privilege to introducing a good friend of the school from the University of Washington, the Evans School of Public Affairs, Craig Thomas. Craig came to visit us this time as part of the CCG Consortium on Collaborative Governance Faculty Exchange Series. And what Craig is going to talk about, I'm sure he will explain it in more detail, is not a finished research project. It's something that he's developing the idea and trying to get funding. And so he's not going to report specific finding, but will share with you some of his conceptual framework and how he's going to approach the research. So let's welcome Craig.
It's great fun to be here. I was hoping the weather would be super awesome yesterday because it's been bad in Seattle, but it was actually worse here yesterday than it was in Seattle. But today's great. Thanks all for coming. And as Jan pointed out, this is a work in progress. I recently submitted an NSF proposal, second time. It's pretty far along conceptually, and we've begun to gather some evidence, but I'm not going to be throwing up a whole bunch of regression tables and trying to walk through all these findings. Instead, this is going to be much more conceptual and theoretical and talking about the research design and hoping for feedback. I didn't want to present completed work on collaborative governance because I don't like to present completed work that's been published or coming out. I like to present work in progress. It's more fun for me, and I like to get feedback. So let me just quickly, this is what I'm going to cover. And by the way, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. I don't need to wait for Q&A. I enjoy being interrupted. So quickly, I'm just going to talk about my research agenda on collaborative governance because I've been doing this for about 10 years, and I wanted to show you how this fits into my longer-term research agenda. I do other kinds of work as well, having to do with regulation and centralized planning and environmental behavior, but this is my primary research area. It's why I'm involved. I love the Consortium on Collaborative Governance. So I'll talk about environmental governance systems generally because this is what I do. All my work is in the environment with regard to collaboration, but not necessarily my other work. And what I then will do is talk through these theoretical frameworks. And I haven't worked much with agency theory before. So I look forward to feedback. And I've never worked with resource dependency theory before. And so for those of you who are doing this or have done it before, I would love your feedback, particularly if I'm being too simple. In particular with resource dependence theory, I found it hard to extract unique hypotheses and try to find things that are unique, not because it's a bad theory, just to make it work for what I'm thinking about. So I'll go through the hypotheses and research questions, the methods, some of which we've started and plan to use to test the theories. No findings in the big picture next time. And then some summary comments. And again, if you have questions as we go, feel free. So just a bigger picture of what I've been doing on collaborative governance. It started with my first book called Bureaucratic Landscapes. And what I was doing with that was focusing on agency actors and how they differ in a variety of ways, and then thinking about the bureaucratic characteristics of their agencies that enable them, encourage them to collaborate across jurisdictions or not, and to bring in other kinds of actors, other kinds of stakeholders. So that was my beginning, and I wrote about biodiversity conservation. That was the topic with multiple cases. Then more recently, I've been getting into stuff having to do with collaborative performance, a lot of stuff on how you would measure it, think about it, build it in, this most recent one in Public Performance and Management Review, build it into performance assessment. So I've been doing some stuff on performance management systems about how measures that are used, like in the performance assessment rating tool, and how you'd build in data gathering and self-assessments of programs, both at the federal level, but also it's happening at the local level. King County, where Seattle is, 14th biggest county in the country, has their own system, and they have some interesting data. I've also reinitiated stuff having to do with how science is used in collaborative partnerships. This again was in my first book. how science was informing things the agencies were doing, and then for changing their behavior and leading them to collaborate more. And I have this fun new project with one of my grad students who is finishing up a big analysis of a bunch of case studies of collaborative partnerships and how science was used and misused in these partnerships. And then a major theme has been the role of government. It's sparking, maintaining, encouraging, getting in the way of these kinds of collaborative partnerships. And that began with the second book with Tom Kuntz. I cite him a lot because I've been working a lot with Tom Kuntz. I should have acknowledged my co-authors, Tom Kuntz at Ohio State in the School of Natural Resources and Environmental Affairs. I've done a lot of work with him on collaborative partnerships. And this new project with Clara Ryan, who's in the School of Environment and Forest Resources at the University of Washington. Sorry, Clara and Tom, I overlooked you. So this is coming more out of that original work with Tom Kuntz, and this is today's talk. So this notion of policy tools and how they would affect collaborative partnerships is somewhat quite different. So we're trying to think about the rule systems embedded in policy tools and how it would affect the rule systems that are in the collaborative partnerships. So anyway, big picture, this is where this picture is spinning off from, and hopefully we'll go somewhere with a lot of funding. So just to step back, again, I'm doing this in the realm of environmental governance, and there's other types of governance systems that aren't collaborative, both of which I've written about in other kinds of work. And there's limitations for these kinds, as many of you know who do the environmental stuff, know that there's these limitations that drive why collaborative partnerships emerge, because they have to have a purpose if people are voluntarily doing these things for some public good. One is non-point source pollution, so the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act are particularly good about dealing with point sources like smokestacks and effluent discharges and automobiles, but it's not good at Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act and dealing with non-point, like for me, particularly agricultural runoff coming off of farms, and you can't see the people where it's coming from necessarily. You also have cases where regulatory target populations are hard to find. They disappear, they're hard to see in the moment, there's too many of them, and so you need other kinds of voluntary compliance or collaborative approaches to deal with that. This is where I started with centralized planning of public resources, because this has been a big thing over the last 100 years. The original, the epitome of bureaucracy was U.S. Forest Service. That's what Herbert Kaufman wrote about in his 1960 book. The Bureau of Reclamation, all of these big agencies doing centralized planning that were hard for them to collaborate, but there was reasons why they started to emerge. And our focus is on watershed partnerships. And the way to think about this is it's a regional thing where you're looking at a watershed as a landscape. And you know, when you go around looking at pretty pictures, you often think, wow, you know, Darby Creek's been studied a fair amount in Ohio. This is really beautiful. Obviously, it's preserved. Well, it's actually not. I mean, these rivers are highly polluted and around farmlands. They're highly loaded with organic and non-organic phosphates and nitrogen fertilizers. It leads to all sorts of problems, hypoxia, low oxygen. There's so much deoxygenation from these hyper-algal blooms that in the summer and fall, a huge part of the outlet of the Mississippi is a gigantic dead zone. And a lot of these streams and rivers are too, because so much is going in. So you look at it, and non-point source discharges from ag are hard to capture. So you get these collaborative efforts going to try to get people to stop. Here's another surprising one. If you know, the Superfund has a national priorities list for cleaning up super, super dirty toxic sites. And there's some that you wouldn't think about. Not just mines, but abandoned mines. Companies that went broke, they pulled back into Australia or whatever and leave these big messes. They're not around for restoration actions, and so you often get these collaborative efforts to come together to try to clean these things up. So there's a picture of the Animas River loaded with mine tailings up and down, leaching all sorts of horrible things like arsenic into the water. Animas looks really beautiful, but below the surface. By the way, I'm in Puget Sound, which people come and look at the Puget Sound and go, oh my God, this is beautiful. Well, actually, there are dead zones in the Puget Sound. There's lots of problems. There's so much medication being discharged that you can go out and actually see the results of people's prescriptions. You can pick them out in water samples. And then they do all sorts of weird things to the marine life. They're bioaccumulating.
You could have a good Puget Sound water as a health.
A place you drink it.
I can see it now,
Yeah, if you want birth control stuff and all sorts of weird antidepressants. By the way, do not flush your medications down the toilet. They aren't cleaned out of by plants. Right out, as well as surface runoff and stuff. So anyway, I just wanted to run through, there's all this stuff that looks really good, but with regard to watershed protection, there's lots of problems. Another one that, I started with my first efforts, this is Oregon. This is just federal and state lands. They're highly fragmented, and if you were to zoom in, even on the Forest Service lands in green, you'd see it's all checkerboarded. And so habitat, to the extent you care about preserving habitat and species, it's highly checkerboarded, and therefore you need collaborative efforts to bring people together because there's no regulations that say you have to. And you're in the desert Southwest, travel out. That's what these rivers should look like. This is what cows do to them, why they're hot. Go sit in the water. Privately owned cows on public lands, they're actually not regulated, they're grandfathered, and so if you want to do things about them, you get collaborative efforts together like the Gila River Watershed Council in Arizona. So these are just some examples, and we're working in the area of watershed partnerships, been doing this for a while. Actually not that long compared to my other work. So there's the Russian River in California, super beautiful, lots of problems. And here you've got the Russian River Council meeting, a lot of stakeholders at it. So we're studying those people as an example, or we haven't picked that case yet, more on that in a moment. And so here's the big picture, what we're trying to do, which we claim is novel. So if you don't think it's novel, please let me know. So we're looking at watershed partnerships, state watershed programs, and policy tools, and we want to link them all together. And just to give you some quick terms, so watershed partnership is a formal organization. This is important because if it's not formalized in some sense with members and rules and all this stuff, if it's just a bunch of people hanging out for cheese and wine or something, this doesn't count. It's got to be formalized. Composed of public, private, and nonprofit actors working together voluntarily. This is very key. They're doing it because they want to. Public agency folks are showing up because they want to. Nobody's forced to be there, except the agency folks might supposedly have to attend a meeting to achieve specific goals. So we're framing it in a particular way. This is a pretty standard definition, by the way, of a collaborative organization. And also, we're using the term partnership just because in the watershed world, that's the term they use. That's the colloquial term. But in an organizational sense, and we're talking about them as organizations, they're a type of collaborative organization. And so to talk about them in terms of agency theory or resource dependence theory, the unit of analysis is the organization. I'll be bouncing around between these terms. But watershed partnership is the colloquial term. Sometimes they're also called councils, like the Russian River Council. So excuse me if I'm bouncing around between these terms. But unit of analysis is organizations. Yep?
What makes something formal? What's your criteria?
I'll come back to that. Rule systems, we're using the institutional analysis and development framework to measure things. Kind of looking at informal norms, which we'll pick up later, but that's not the main thing. Because what we want to see is if the formal mechanisms of the policy tool change the formal organizational structure of the collaborative organizations. Thank you. And nicely, all 50 states happen to have their own watershed programs. They're intended to encourage these watershed partnerships in their states to do certain things. And in part, they exist because there's these pass-through monies from the Clean Water Act, Section 319, I think. And so there has to be some mechanism to pass it through, but they do many other kinds of things to promote, and they vary greatly. So you have a 50-state sample in order to choose certain states, and I'll show you the logic of how we chose certain states in a moment. So that's a nice thing of not looking at the federal level, but going right to state level. You get a lot of variation. In policy tools, I'm sure you're familiar with this literature, just the means by which the state programs encourage watershed partnerships to operate in specific ways. And for watershed partnerships, the main thing they're doing, the state programs, is, how did I get that far? The most common policy tools are grants and technical assistance, but there's multiple kinds of grants, and we can parse that out with different kinds of rule systems. And there's different kinds of technical assistance. But they do some other things too. They often have regulatory actions floating in the background. If you don't do these things, then certain kinds of things would likely happen. So here's how we're framing the big picture. The title of the talk, what effect do policy tools have on collaborative organizations? We're just trying to figure out, we argue nobody's ever done it like this before. So we broke it up into 3 separate questions, and then I'll show you in a moment the hypotheses and the methods we'll use and how we've started doing this. So first, what do public officials consider when choosing among policy tools? Agency theory obviously would predict that they're going to do certain things, to provide certain incentives to get these organizations to do certain things. And given that these collaborative organizations are voluntary and they're not necessarily required to do anything except when strings are attached, the principal agent problem is a bit more indirect and harder to deal with. So that's what the program officials are thinking about. How do the members of collaborative organizations perceive these different policy tools? Some of them, they can decide to accept or participate in, to use different scientific evidence, to recruit members from the agencies, bring them into their operating structure, give them decision-making power. There's all sorts of things that they can do. Therefore, how do they think about them and react to them, either as an agent or a dependent organization, depending upon the theory you're working with? And then how do the policy tools in turn affect the structure and behavior? So there are actually changes occurring. And by the way, I'll hope to note this later, we're only selecting watershed partnerships that pre-existed the programs because we want to see change. So we're not asking the question how many of these partnerships formed because the money was there.
Then what happened to form before that?
Yeah, we're not actually addressing that. We're taking the...
Do you know?
Well, we would know once we do the research, but that's not part of our sample selection strategy.
So in other words, these were spontaneously formed in some sense.
Yeah, there's different reasons why they would form. An important reason is when they're dealing with things in the regulatory shadow, meaning this is a way of addressing a regulation. My big area has been the Endangered Species Act. So there's species that are across jurisdictions, and people will get hammered in private, local government, and state government if they don't do anything.
So they're not spontaneous. They're always formed in the shadow of some state power.
Maybe, but many are, but not all. Some are spontaneous just because people want to do things. So the Darby Creek one I actually showed earlier on the picture, that was formed by the Nature Conservancy, which is one of the richest, it may still be the richest environmental nonprofit there is. And the Nature Conservancy realized it can't buy up all the land and have it bequested to deal with all these issues, that there's lots of other things going on. So the Nature Conservancy got the Darby Creek Partnership going. And so you could call that spontaneous. There wasn't operating in the shadow of the law because the Clean Water Act doesn't cover that kind of thing.
No, I think you should spend a little time as you do your research understanding where they came from.
Oh, definitely.
All right, because I think that's going to be very interesting.
A lot of our prior research was doing that.
All right.
In fact, most of it. And so now we're trying to get more specific.
I'm just saying, I'd like to know.
It's definitely part of our research. We'll be asking.
You know, because you want to know where these kinds of things come out of. I mean, I always assume they come out because someone feels, a hammer. There are some, of course, virtuous people, but all 7 of them don't usually account for the 50 states. I don't know.
By the way, I'm kind of cynical in that regard too, that they're operating, and that there aren't a lot of virtuous people, and people are participating because they're operating in a regulatory shadow, but not all of them. So I agree. I've actually done a lot of research on this before. Tom Kuntz has separately, and many other people. Sabatier and all of his people doing the Advocacy Coalition framework. They've done a lot of research in Oregon, Washington, and California with 100 or more partnerships looking at coalition formation and why and all that stuff having to do with ACF, which all that coalition framework stuff is separate from the kind of stuff we're doing with different theories. So those are the three, it's dominoes falling to answer the bigger one, but we want to know what the public officials were thinking in designing it, how the collaborative organizations are perceiving and therefore reacting to it, having already pre-existed.
Craig, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So in the choice of tools, is that legislatively done or is it done at the regulatory level?
Both. So this is one of the things we're going to have to learn when we go to the state.
Because you seem to have very different political process. Because, I mean, when you say what do public officials consider, it sounds so rational. And since I spent most of my time trying to convince my students that politics are not rational and that public choices don't usually reflect rational actor behavior.
I'm coming back to that.
Okay. Because I would phrase it differently because the term public official is so generic,
It's
and
generic.
consider seems to apply in a way that kind of ignores a lot of science literature on policy formulation.
Yes, I agree. So one of the things we'll be looking at is going to the state program officials who are running these things and asking them how they're designing it explicitly, but also where, if the legislature is involved, interviewing the legislative people to figure out what's going on there. So public officials is quite generic here, yes.
Really what you're asking is what motivates the public official to choose certain set?
Yeah.
Is the motivation.
But I mean, if not to belabor it, but if politics is this kind of rough and tumble process, it may not actually reflect anyone's motivations.
Exactly.
That's the problem.
That would be a problem with agency theory, which actually I have in the next slide. But yeah, it's a test, because if you can't show that people had rationally thought about this in order to make this causal thing happen, but it came out for other reasons, then for answering the first question,
Well, the second two questions are still quite relevant.
yes, exactly.
It just makes you then feel a little concerned about how well you are going to be able to convey advice based on them.
Tony?
Yeah. Despite the fact I dissent from a lot of the stuff that was just said, I want to focus on C. I'm not sure I understand what you're after there, and I know you'll get to it, but in saying how the policy tools affect the structure and behavior of the collaborative organizations, why aren't the policy tools endogenous to the structure and behavior of the collaborative organizations? What am I missing there?
What do you mean there in that? Because the policy tools are...
These organizations, make possible a set of policy tools and sort of focus us on them.
So just backing up, the collaborative organizations are the watershed partnerships. The state programs create the policy tools in order to influence what this
So they come in exogenous.
Exogenous. Right.
I'm clear now.
Okay.
So what about, so you talk about 50 states, every state has this kind of thing. So are there kind of institutional differences across
Yes.
states to maybe a prior question would be those institutional differences?
Yeah.
The state
So
level?
I'll run through these. These are great clarifying questions, but I think some of them might be in the slides. Tony had me worried for a moment there with endogeneity problem.
Well, if those organizations actually lobby, there could be some
Yes.
spontaneity.
Yes, exactly. And hopefully we'd pick up on that, but we're not down into that nitty-gritty yet. So before what I'm going to do is run through the two theories we think might be useful here. Again, there's other bodies of literature going after collaborative organizations, relationship between government and the collaborative organizations, and why the organizations form, particularly the Advocacy Coalition framework stuff has been doing this, but we want to come at it with other theoretical frameworks. So just very quickly, before I get into hypotheses and methods, again, ask any questions, because this is where I know we start tripping, trying to come up with what would be unique tests of the theory. So if you've read it, everybody cites Eisenhart, which is, Catherine Eisenhart, business school professor, first packaged it all up in a way everybody was citing. And the gist, so it comes out of the business school and has been imported into nonprofit literature and the public sector. The gist is that principals devise rules and incentives to align the behavior of agents with the interests of the principals in the presence of asymmetric information or incomplete information. And so, this is boards of directors at firms and getting people in the firms behave a certain way, and nonprofits, it's the board trying to get what the nonprofits do. And for us, it's can you make an argument that the state agency officials, the program, the legislature, whatever, when we get there, is somehow designing these policy tools in a way that causes the collaborative organizations to do certain things, because what often is happening is these collaborative organizations are doing things as proxies for what the state could do. That the state can walk away and not regulate in particular and allow these organizations to do something instead of the public sector. So an application issue is for doing it in our area, and presumably even in other contexts, is that some agents may be less likely to shirk and more likely to develop cooperative norms with the principals due to intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So, this is the literature on public service motivation. Organizations or individuals going to do certain things more likely in the public sector than in the private. And since these collaborative organizations are probably composed of a lot of people who are not self-interested, by the way, there are some members who are very self-interested to protect their cows on public lands. We have to think about the motivations of and whether or not agency theory would help in that regard. Dan?
I'm back to, if you will, just to step back, usually we intervene, so I'm going to just,
Please.
The fact that these are in 50 states is, I don't think by accident or independent, 50 independent activities or events. But my little knowledge of what's happened in this area is there's a dramatic diffusion of adopting collaborative strategies. So that the tools that you talked about as the intervention are not selected independently across the 50, but they're really a diffusion process.
Yeah.
First of all, the watershed formations are a diffusion process.
Yeah.
Going scale to 50 states is a extension of that diffusion process.
Yeah.
I can think of the universities that advocate that and send their students out to do it. So there's a process for which this is happening in our society over about 10 years. It saturates 50 states. But these aren't independent activities and they aren't independent tools. That is separate from one another or independently decided upon. Because most of the time, at least the few I watched, they didn't stop or begin and say, how should we do this? They said, how's X doing it? And how's Y doing it? And what did Thomas's article tell us about that? Or at least in the university it would ask that.
Yeah, we won't tell you anything about that yet. Because what I'll show you in a minute, how we're thinking about the selection is not, that's one explanation of why agency officials or state legislatures may have designed it in a particular way that's an alternative explanation to agency theory. And I completely accept that as an alternative hypothesis.
But I wonder if I could pursue it also.
Yeah.
Then you're going to talk to the participants, you're going to interview them,
Yeah.
and I would suspect, actually guess pretty strongly, that depending on whether they're the environmentalist, the landholder, the ag, the cattle producer, or the rancher rather, all of them, they actually communicate too horizontally. And their reactions are probably comparable across these experiences. That's a hypothesis.
Okay. Yeah, I hadn't put that up. I hadn't thought about that one as an alternative. Yeah, we're definitely not explaining where the state, we're not trying to explain everything about where the state policy programs came from, why they adopted them, but we will ask questions that would test particular theories. But that's a question we should ask because of, mimetic isomorphism, as the institutional theorists would say. You're blindly copying what other people do because you don't know what else to do. But there's a lot of diversity in the sample. So there are other factors as well.
Last thing then, you want to know when they came online.
Well, geographic proximity.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Diffusion
guys,
and timeline.
yeah. So we're not testing policy diffusion stuff like Barry and Barry. Although we could ask for more money from a different source to do that. I don't do event history analysis, but I guess I could learn. So with resource dependence theory, key citation is Pfeffer and Solancic, External Control of Organizations, the book. So the gist is that organizations, in this case the collaborative organizations, partnerships, will seek to increase their autonomy by reducing their dependence on other organizations like the state or foundations. So in this theory, power trumps efficiency or rent sinking or whatever, that what they're doing is trying just to maintain their autonomy and their control, and it's building on the power literature, particularly the organization theory stuff going back to James Thompson's seminal 1967 book, Organizations in Action. So it's built heavily on this power and interdependence argument, and sometimes when people use the theory, it's used very metaphorically, so it can be hard to extract hypotheses that are very useful. Jan's done this with his co-author, Delphin, whose first name I'm forgetting. Not metaphorical, actually developing hypotheses. So the thing about resource dependency theory is it's less developed than agency theory. There's fewer hypotheses. It's harder to extract them. For me, you have to stay away from power as a term because it's hard to show power imbalances, and we're not trying to do that. We're trying to figure out, by interviewing people in particular, if they're choosing how they respond to these policy tools or choosing not even to participate in the state watershed programs, why, and it would hypothetically differ. So why these theories? Why did we choose them, even though we haven't done them in the past, really? Here's where I'm stumbling around. I won't critique anybody else. So the way we got into it was that agency theory might explain why government officials select specific policy tools for shaping the structure and behavior of collaborative organizations, but there could be a lot of other reasons. Juliet's point, they're simply politically expedient rather than goal-oriented. They're cheaper. We've heard this kind of argument. While you do this, you give out some technical assistance or very cheap grants because they're really easy to do and they're politically expedient, and you don't really believe they're going to change what organizations do, or are they making tough calls and trying to get these collaborative organizations to do different things? There's a variety of reasons why they do it, and Dan brought up the other one that you're copying what other states are doing. So that's another alternative I could put up here. Probably should at some point. Definitely should. So why resource dependence theory? Well, we thought about this one more from the bottom up. Rather than the principle down, that resource dependence theory might help more with explaining why the collaborative partners develop particular organizational structures, the formal organizational structures, i.e. the rule systems, more on that in a minute, to pursue specific actions. But alternatives might be a variety of things. The policy tools have no effect because they're trivial compared with goals. One could think of others I'm sure I'm leaving out, like Dan pointed out earlier. And you might have some if you've been working with resource dependence theory. So let me go to the hypotheses. And this is where it's key, because you have to be able, ideally you'd have unique tests of the you'd have unique hypotheses coming out of the theories, and therefore you have direct tests of the theories. So here goes. So question one, going back to the three questions, linking the public policy tools, the choice of them to so the choice of them by the state program people, public officials, down to the collaborative partnerships. Starting with question one, what do the public officials, which we'll define better later, consider when choosing among policy tools? Now I'm always going to be thinking about Juliet. But you're exactly right. We thought about this before.
Well, you might see very different considerations or I mean, you might think that you would be more likely to see a kind of classic principal-agent type of relationship at the regulatory level, and more kind of a more Kingdon type, sort of law of the hammer operating at a legislative
That's
level.
right. And that's why that's exactly why we've been using public officials rather than saying program staff, program directors, because we plan to do legislative interviews as well. So that's a loosey-goosey term. So here's what we've derived. And what we tried to do is counterpoise a hypothesis from agency theory with a hypothesis from resource dependence theory, so to try to force out some unique tests that would show why one would explain more than another. So from agency theory, it's pretty straightforward. State agency officials prefer rule-based policy tools such as restrictive grants, more on this in a minute, if they're unable to develop norms of cooperation with watershed partnerships on the presumption that, this goes back to the previous thing about application, that norms of cooperation are more likely to emerge if people are public-oriented. Tony?
So I'm not entirely sure who your principal and agents are here in this setup, and I think it's important for you to draw that out clearly, right? So you started out by saying that, for example, legislations create these policy tools, right? So maybe there's some
Not
sort
all
of
of them.
right. But there's some sort of effective delegation in the legislation, right? So one argument is that your principle is the enacting coalition of your legislation, which is probably not it, given that you're talking about these public officials. So there's those delegations, whatever they are giving you a second set of people who I think you're also calling principals, and that might be some bureaucrats somewhere down the line. And then in terms of the agents, who are the agents? These people are unorganized, or do the organizations exist ex ante? So the organizations exist ex ante to the whole
it's the
problem.
organizations, because it's at the organizational level, and the organizations exist ex ante.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So then you're what I would, right, in any principal agent problem, you have two constraints that have to be satisfied, or else you won't get the response. There has to be a participation constraint satisfied and an incentive compatibility constraint satisfied. And those two would strike me as being pretty interesting, given that you're talking about collaborations. And so I think the level of abstraction that you're talking about agency theory makes it somewhat untestable, but you could move in the direction of making it testable by thinking about the specific agency problem at issue here. I think Juliet's leaning in that direction too, by saying, there are a whole lot of principles that could be driving these problems, but you haven't really tied them down, and before you get to a hypothesis, because I that might be true, but it also might not be true, and if there's no, if the constraints fail, that might be why you get no norms of cooperation. And so that's where the problem in defining the hypothesis might be. So you might have if you're very clear about your agency relationships, you might actually get a different hypothesis. You will get different hypotheses in different cases.
So just going back, you said there's two constraints that must be satisfied. So
participation and incentive compatibility, and right. So if I'm willing to not be involved in the collaborative effort at all, right, then the participation constraint is not going to be satisfied. And so that's basically, I'll go off and do these things on my own, pick up, garbage along the river, and
just do that myself because it's better than dealing with you people. And then incentive compatibility is going to fail if you're not giving me the appropriate incentives and you get agency loss from what the principal wants just because you're not properly incentivized to
See, Tony, you're actually, I think that's getting to the second set of questions, which is how these principal-agent relationships affect the organization.
But I still don't understand that.
Well,
I think maybe a prior question is, why wouldn't the agency people try to do everything by themselves first? There must be a reason, the background situation that, okay, you can't do it well,
That's
so
what we're talking
you have
about.
to rely on this bunch of unstable partnerships. Then you think about how to deal with these unstable partnerships.
Or no partnership at all, right? So these are all what Jan and I are talking about are the exact same thing.
So why wouldn't the agency officials, right, okay.
Since that could be framed as a transaction cost problem. I don't want to muddle your theoretical framework, but so when people compare resource dependency, one contrast is transaction cost. Transaction cost drive for efficiency. Resource dependency deals with power inequality.
Yes, and we're avoiding TCE.
can we see the second, the RDT hypothesis, since you seem so bashful about them?
No, I'm not being bashful. I'm harder, so here's what we're trying to extract. So state, I think if I remember Jan and his co-author had hypotheses like this. State level officials prefer short-term prescriptive grants over long-term capacity building grants because the short-term prescriptive grants would increase the dependence of the watershed partnerships because they're short-term, you got to keep on coming for them. Therefore, they're more likely to change what they do, more on that, how we measure that, thereby increasing the state's ability to influence them because they have to keep coming back rather than just giving them lots of money for startup. And I'll show you how this is varied in the different states. So this would be the RDT resource dependence hypothesis to answer question 1. What are the public officials considering? Are they trying?
So if you see, so what you're saying is that you would look at some measure of cooperativeness, and if you can associate it with lower reliance on rule-based policy tools, then that would support your first hypothesis.
Say that again.
I'm trying to understand whether these are actually discrete.
That's what I'm struggling with.
So
Because I want them to be discrete.
the way you would okay, so if you measure how cooperative organizations are, these watershed councils are, however that might be, like not having a lot of cow farmers or whatever.
It's more that they're cooperative with what the state program officials want.
Right, so it would,
Yes.
one way you could, for argument's sake, the way you could operationalize that is that the more you have environmental advocates in the council and fewer cattle farmers and private people who are going to be troublesome, then that might suggest that they would have greater norm-alliance.
See, this is what we're trying to do is avoid, that's the advocacy coalition framework territory. And so it's like the transaction cost avoid, because we don't want to be, we're trying to go into specific theories, and yes, we can get into transaction cost economics, but that would be a different kind of argument. And we could also float into the advocacy coalition formation stuff.
Whether there are norms of cooperation? I'm just trying to understand whether you could have organizations that have cooperative norms, but you still, how do you rule out the second hypothesis in the presence of cooperative norms? Both of those could actually function simultaneously. You could have cooperative, those are not mutually exclusive from the standpoint of a state agency official, because you could have, cooperative players, but nonetheless, so you're saying if you see cooperative players but rule-based policy tools, that's support for the second hypothesis. That's what you're saying.
I think the problem is the second hypothesis is unconditional. You're saying that state official always prefer.
Right, that's the point.
Yes.
You don't have a condition that could apply both in the presence of cooperative and uncooperative players. So that you can, if you see cooperative players in the presence of rule-based policy tools, that's essentially discrediting your first hypothesis. But it doesn't actually lend support for your second hypothesis, and I don't see any way for it. I don't know how you discredit the second hypothesis. That's
Yeah, I'm just
Yeah,
writing
you're
this.
writing.
I'm writing Juliet's brilliant comment.
Sure,
Yeah.
okay.
Everybody's are brilliant, even if I don't write them down.
so if we make a comment and you don't write it down, you're going, that
Yeah.
was stupid.
I would be offended if you don't write this one down. But
We went to graduate school
your
together.
hypothesis, the second one.
Yeah.
So you say state level officials prefer short-term prescriptive grants over long-term capacity building grants. That's a hypothesis.
Yes.
But then you go and suggest the reason, and it may not be that reason at all.
Right, that's the other thing.
Yeah, that's right, because the because shouldn't be in hypotheses.
So you're presuming the answer.
Yes.
And I would actually look elsewhere for the answer to that than the one you've given. So I have a different.
Your suggestion be?
Oh, I think that they have they are task order functionally oriented, and if you're the watershed management agency or the water resources management of the state of California, if someone says they're going to help you clean up the water, you might give them a capacity grant. But if someone says we need your money to facilitate this dialogue, they'll say go see the Irvine Foundation, because they don't have the latitude to give out money with the legislator looking over their shoulders, as they will in California, or the governor, or the budget office saying, what the hell are you funding this talkathon for? They're going to say, unless you've cleaned up the river. So that they're going to be more demanding of the outcome. But that's just a guess on my part. But that's why you have a hypothesis, but I don't like the explanation.
Right. Right. The because shouldn't be in there because it's implied.
But why, I guess I'm curious, why do you want to counterpose these two theories?
Well, it's not that if this one was true, this one wouldn't be true. Is how do they help you understand the first question? Because when we started this, we were thinking that the first question, the answer would be primarily agency theory. We weren't thinking and we were thinking about more like the third question. The second would be more resource dependence theory, would be more likely to explain it. But then we started to think, well, maybe you could have hypotheses for each question, but not necessarily that if one was supported, the other one necessarily would not be. So the way of framing it conditionally helps in that regard, because we weren't thinking, at least I wasn't thinking, about if one's true, the other's not. But it would be nice if you could frame it that way. But that's not what we were trying to do.
Okay, that just, when you put them up there, they seem like they're
Exactly.
competing hypotheses, but you're not intending them to be.
No.
Okay.
No. And there's many reasons, even if the hypothesis is true, it may not be because of the because. And so you need to ask questions in your interviews, survey, or surveys that would get at the because. David?
I guess my question is, so you're saying rule-based policy tools are a set of tools, and restrictive grants you're using as the example that you're most interested in.
Because restrictive grants have more rules embedded in them
Right.
than the capacity building grants.
So could you gain something by looking at it as a continuum in that there's kind of more coercive types of rule-based policy tools. There are restrictive grants, and then there are quasi-unrestricted grants.
Yes, that's what we're trying to do.
Okay.
Excellent. Excellent, because I was already thinking that way.
It seems like that's where you might benefit from the resource dependence theory, because what you're saying is that the mechanism by which you can control the actions of these partnerships is through the power of the purse. And so, you know, whether you're using grants or other types of rule-based policy tools, you would expect the behavior to differ, because resource dependency theory applies more when you have grants in play than when you're not talking about financial exchanges.
See, I'm writing it down.
We'll want to check his notes after.
This is a
Dumbest idea I've ever heard.
One suggestion for the first one, I don't know why you have to bring in norms of cooperation. In my view, the agency theory is the principal can trust the agent more if they can if they believe, the principal believe they will do a good job for the principal, right? So why don't you frame it as if they believe they can further the goals of the officials, why would you have to twist around to talk about norms? So you're implying if you have good norm for cooperation, they do a better job, right? Or so is there a reason why you want to bring in these norms of cooperation? Because it's presuming better norm, better effect, right? Is that what you're saying?
Better norm. The more the more the collaborative organizations have a history of working with the state officials, the more likely you can trust them to do things in the absence of specific agency oversight. And this is also more likely to vary. It's one of the things I have later. I don't want to rush through this, by the way, is the distance. I think somebody raised this maybe, the distance of the collaborative organization from the state offices, because the closer they are to specific organizations, the more they can develop its norms of cooperation with the state, because the state reps will be at the meetings.
But that's sort of behind what I was trying to say. I mean, so from a resource dependency perspective, you want to restrict what they do, because even though the people work well with each other, but what they do might be actually subverting what we want. So you want to control them instead of supporting what they're doing, sort of necessarily facilitating what they're doing. I don't know where I got. You see what I'm saying? I mean,
no, I know what you mean, and the way this, and I see the clumsiness of the way we phrased it. We were trying to think. We believe that. How do I phrase this? All these policy tools, or most of them, have rules embedded in them, and if you don't have the rules, to the extent that there aren't rules in the policy tools, then you must believe that the watershed organizations are going to cooperate with your desires. And we assumed, because of things we've already studied, that some watershed organizations are more likely to be cooperative anyway, therefore you can be less restrictive with what you give them. But I know this is really clumsy, and it's part of the packaging, trying to put things together, and then in this herky-jerky way. But I agree, it's clumsy.
My name is Janelle, and I'm first year PhD in policy. And I have a question regarding to the watershed partnership. So I'm wondering whether that typical type of collaboration matters, or if we change to other kind of organization, for example, land conservation or like forest protection, will you change your hypothesis with the same questions remain? I'm just wondering the difference.
Yes, from our own research, very likely so. And so we're arguing that we want to hold types of issues constant. And in fact, we're holding types, by choosing particular states, we're holding other things within types of watersheds constant. So yes, I agree that that is very likely so, but we're trying to hold a lot of things constant. And because we can grab at all of these because of the watershed programs. But I agree, this is definitely a limitation of whatever we find. Janelle, right? Okay. I didn't write that down. I can usually remember names. So let me just run through the others, since that's only question one. So the second one was, how do the collaborative organizations perceive them and then presumably react to them? So for agency theory, this is just, again, Tony others were helping a lot with on question one to try to make them much more precise. This one just seems, I don't know, obvious, too simple, whatever. Watershed partnerships respond to policy tools that help the partnership attain its public service goals. Now that I'm looking at it, I'm really thinking it's lame. and because again, we're trying to get hypotheses from the different theories that would help with each stage, each question. Resource dependence theory, watershed partnerships prefer less restrictive policy tools, for example, long-term capacity building grants. By the way, we do have variation in different types of grants with restrictions, even if they come with fewer resources. So this is pretty straightforward. So rather than trying to maximize the net or the value over time of particular grants, they're going to prefer less restrictive ones overall so they can do what they want. But how to juxtapose that with the agency theory
Your
one?
agency theory one also needs to be about preferences rather than responses, because question 3 is getting at responses, right? So, I mean, I wouldn't an agent also prefer less restrictive policy tools? I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
sure you actually get different hypotheses.
Why would they prefer less restrictive, not more?
No, they would prefer less restrictive grants, an agent,
Because
because the whole
oh,
idea,
excuse
I
me.
thought the
I
whole,
meant I was thinking the principal.
no,
who said
the
that.
agent would prefer
Yeah.
less restrictive policy tools. Now, whether they prefer them even if they come with fewer resources, it seems to me would depend on that point that Tony brought up, which is about the incentive alliance. Because if they have incentive alliance, they wouldn't care as much about it being restrictive, and they prefer to have more resources, right? But they may be willing to sacrifice resources for restrictions if there's a disalliance between their incentives and the incentives of the principal. That's what I would think.
Julia's getting at something that, so what I'm worried about is it is exactly what Juliet's bringing up here, is that there's sort of a straw man of agency theory, and the straw man is just this. Agency theory means the principal agent problem has been solved. And that, of course, would not be an agency theory, right? I don't know what agency theory as sort of a general conception actually means. I don't really get what the predictions would be. I understand it as a sort of class of theories. But what Juliet's saying now about these things not being the case, it's also the case that in an agency, you could write down an agency problem in which the principal would rather the agent have more discretion. Happens all the time.
They don't know when the heck should happen.
Yeah, I mean, you got to write down the problem. We don't know the informational assumptions or anything like that, right? So the specificity of the particular relationship, which Juliet has brought up a few very good examples of where this is biting. It's the specificity of the agency relationship that you don't have, and as a result, you don't have the clean prediction. Whereas I don't know much about resource dependence theory, but you actually have a slightly cleaner prediction.
And it may be, depending on what else these agents actually do, right? It may be that they don't want any more discretion because they're already doing a bunch of other things, right? They're out there picking up trash along the river, and now you're going to tell them that if they involve themselves in this collaboration, they're going to have to do all these other things, which place demands on their time and whatnot. And that's so we don't know that either.
Or if you have, not to let you go further, but what if you have a partnership where you don't have, well, sorry, that was not intended. What if you have a partnership where you have some internal disagreement between, say, the executive board and the members, and the executive board is environmentalist dominated, and they might welcome restrictions that then actually give them some clout internally in actually getting the partnership to be more environmentally restrictive. So there may be an internal story also.
I was going to ask, if I may follow up on that, if you're going to ask the different categories of stakeholders these questions for that very reason, which is those that perceive themselves with the least power would prefer the most restrictions that lead in their direction.
Yeah, as long as the restrictions are.
So it could be
in
the
line.
local farmers prefer really tight restrictions, which means you can't stop me from farming or using pesticides, and that's a restriction that they want as fending off the challenges or the requests from the other partners.
Yeah, that's the problem with using watershed partnership as the entity responding as a whole. You're assuming it's almost like acting as an organization, which is
Right.
not.
You can get an average response from them, but it probably matters an awful lot by the stakeholders within.
Yeah, and that's who we'll be interviewing and surveying, but it's not stated in the hypotheses in a way like that.
Related to that is, what are these actual like organizations? Like
David wants to say something.
No, I was just curious. What are these as organizations? Are these independent organizations that take on? Do they form as 501c3s? Do they have any sort of?
Not always, but there are a variety of types that would, these organizational characteristics would be things we'd be finding out. But many of them are 501c3s, and they're receiving donations from all sorts of places.
One of the challenges I'm having with both question 1 and question 2 is that agency theory has a fundamentally rational systems approach to human behavior. Resource dependence theory has a fundamentally natural systems approach to human behavior. And so to me, that explains Juliet's response to your hypothesis 2b. It's absolutely correct that from an agency theory perspective, you would expect the agent to shirk. Right, so you want to make the assumption that they will try to shirk.
Only,
and so
not in all strands.
But no, because for me, that's the difference between agency theory and stewardship theory, is that agency theory has a fundamentally rational systems. Game theory, you have to control, because you're the principal, you want to make sure the agent does what you want them to do. Whereas with the natural systems theory, cooperation, collaboration, trust, that's why I have an issue with hypothesis 1a, is you make it contingent on them already trying to have attempted to establish trust. And so that's where I don't have an issue with hypothesis 1a being policymakers will want a rational restrictive tool, period. So there's no need to have the contingency at all about that. So that's where I'm having a problem. It's not with your actual hypotheses, it's with the underlying motivation of the actors behind them. And that's the trouble, and that's why I agree with Juliet that hypothesis 2b to me reads more like an agency theory explanation than a resource dependence theory explanation.
And what's a natural systems approach? How would you define that?
Natural systems is this classic view of collaboration, cooperation, trust, that people develop these social bonds that have very little to do with the clear, restrictive, punitive approaches to dealing with. So you move from agency theory to stewardship theory once you have developed these norms of reciprocity, these norms of trust, these collaborative relationships, that I can pick up the phone with you and say, you know what, if I don't let you know about this, I could probably game you for a little more of X, Y, and Z. But because we trust each other, because we have these long-term bonds, because we care about each other, I want to let you know about this. And that's a fundamentally different view about the human actor and what they do. So that's, and resource dependence theory, with its focus on power, with its focus on human interaction, is much less about the rational actor game than it is about the interaction.
Well, that's why we're using resource dependency theory. But the way you framed agency theory is a very hard line way, but I think if you read like Heinrich and Marschke's recent one in JPAM or others, I think it's much more of a continuum. I'm not familiar with the natural system language, but definitely like the stewardship language, Van Slyke's 2007 piece in JPART and others, but I hadn't heard about language that encompasses something called natural systems. It's bigger.
This is classic Scott stuff, right? Org theory, but you can look at it as the new people that are talking about relational contracting. That's a slightly, from my view of organizational theory, agency theory is the hard view. Relational contracting is still contracting for me. It's still very much
But there's a variation between the two.
Right.
It's not a strict dichotomy.
In my view, it's the economists trying to treat the sociologists seriously and give them a little bit and say, okay, they actually, people do talk to each other and they care, right? So that's the relational contracting view, is there's a little bit more of human interaction to these contracts. But if you take a natural systems view, you move out of that frame entirely. And that's where institutional theory, sociological institutional
Right.
resource dependence theory, they all come from this more
Right.
sociological approach.
Okay. So how do policy tools in turn affect the structure? So the other ones were, behavioral, perceptual, but then to try to go out and measure changes because we start with the baseline before, after. Policy tools that develop norms of cooperation between public agencies and collaboration organizations shape watershed partnership behavior to a greater degree than policy tools that rely on rules requiring certain behaviors.
Well, that's interesting, because that just sounds like Schneider and Ingram to me, which is not agency theory in the least. It's kind of like policy tool learning, social constructivist stuff. Like to me, agency theory would say policy tools that are rule-based get better performance out of the agent than capacity building grants. It just seems, I guess I'm kind of echoing what David was saying, is that there's that sort of a learning thing here that I don't see typically in agent.
Well, one thing I think that's underlying, or assumption that's underlying this, is that the watershed partnerships don't have to participate. They're not required to take the grants, not required to accept the technical assistance. They're operating in the shadow of regulations, perhaps. But I didn't think about this. I mean, I know the Ingram and Schneider work, but that didn't occur to me at all.
A lot about how capacity building, the sort of role of learning, role of policy tools, and it just seems much more consistent with that sort of line of policy theory.
What would be the alternative to hypothesis 3?
3A or
3B. 3B. The more watershed rely on state, the less they conform to what the state wants? That doesn't seem logical.
Wait, what are you asking, Dan?
Well, it says the more watershed partnerships rely on state tools, the more those partnerships change their behavior to match what state level officials want. Great. But would you say the more they do, what would the alternative hypothesis be? The more the partnerships rely on state, the less likely they are?
No.
The more I think that way, what if I...
What would disprove that? Would be no.
You're saying that it's just, if they would have to?
How could it be otherwise? That's a truism, that's not a hypothesis.
No, but the problem is it includes two things. One is resources. The other is depending on
The less you can
rely
find what
on
I
the
want,
tool.
I stop giving you. It's a learning curve here for the state agency.
No, I mean, the way I interpret it is the more money you get from the state, of course, you try to please them and...
There's no dispute with that.
Don't most of those types of theories look at behaviors, not preferences? So the more you give an organization, the more they're going to engage in advocacy, or the more they're going to try to, that's usually how I've seen research dependence is, the more you give a nonprofit from the state, the more they're either going to try to advocate to the state to keep that funding stream, or they're going to not because they don't want to, ruffle the feathers of those people at the state level. So this, what you're talking about preferences here, I guess the question is, if you talk about behaviors, that seems more in line with how resource dependence theory. So, in terms of what they do they try to change the views of the state officials? Do they engage in any sort of lobbying or advocacy or grassroots lobbying or any of those types of things? I think that's the classic type of story of resource dependence theory when it comes to giving to these types of. So that might be the question about how you could disprove it, is whether because they could choose to engage in more advocacy and lobbying or less, and that's been found in the stuff on nonprofits that it can go either way.
Okay. I'll talk with you more later about this because you're working with resource dependency theory now.
Trying.
So am I.
Okay, I think it's time to wrap up.
So just really quickly, again, this is new to us. We haven't been working in this with these theoretical approaches before, and so we need all the help we can get, feedback from people who are doing this. So this is what I wanted to go slow to get your feedback. So, just very quickly regarding our conceptual framework. So the way we're talking about formality is relying on the institutional analysis and development framework to measure rules that are in the policy tools and then the rule systems of the collaborative organizations, particularly with regard to position rules, who's running it, who's participating, participation rules, and decision rules. Those are the main ones. And then operating at several levels of analysis. So I've mentioned that you have the state level, you have the watershed programs, then you have the watershed partnerships with their collaborative organizations. And our response, the way all of our hypotheses have been framed problematically is in terms of an organizational response, but as many people have pointed out, there's also individuals inside and they would perceive the grants and stuff differently, should have thought about that. So that has to do with the way we would frame hypotheses for the actor level, as well as what we would seek to do in the interviews and surveys. So just to set it up, we do so far have the census of all 50 state programs, and then the way we thought about sampling the states, these are the ones we propose to target, and trying to diversify it. And again, like Janelle pointed out, we're holding it all constant with just having watershed partnerships, so the issues tend to be the same, but they're different in the West versus the East, because you have different water laws out here with prior appropriation, and you have different things having to do with supply of water in arid areas versus in the East, where you have other kinds of problems tend to dominate, like agricultural runoff. Two in the West, two in the East, try to hold some things constant. Select policy tools that differ, since most of them are about grants. They differ in interesting ways about grants for planning, grants for implementing projects, grants to do research and development, and we don't have all the things to fill it in, but we're able to map some things out. And whether or not they're just organizational development grants, you're giving them pretty much less restrictive. And then you got two big programs, Pennsylvania and California, and two smaller programs that have less money involved. So we are hopefully cleverly sampling across state programs. And then we're just proposing to pick partnerships, 6 in each of the states, sampling only on those that formed prior to the state watershed program. And then proposively sample, so you have certain kinds of things held constant, vary the age of the partnerships, since one would think that the older they are, the more likely they have a diversified revenue source, vary the distance from state offices, because we know from prior research that the more agency officials are able to participate in the partnerships, the more you develop norms of cooperation, that you could get things to happen in the absence of information about what they're doing. And then we start with open-end interviews, and then with those partnerships, and then do a survey of a much larger set of the partnerships, but testing on a different set of partnerships. So, summary comments. That's where we're at. Submitted it. You were all going. Science of organizations. Hence, organization theory through the science of organizations. So they would be, a lot of it coming from business schools, applicants. So we're not submitting to an environmental or human dimensions division of National Science Foundation, not political science. Hence, the theory is driving where we submitted. So thank you very much.
Thank you.